We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the dooms to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
The following video was actually originally, and still is, on my The Anadromous Life channel. And it's gotten quite a few hits over there. I think it's over 21,000 right now. But I know that the people who come to the Anadromist don't really go over to the Anadromous Life channel, because that's mostly for documents of puppetry and, say, Georgian music and other kinds of cultural documentation. So I decided I'm going to do it here and put it on the Anadromist. And so what I've done is I've edited it in a couple different ways. One of them is I've edited it, I've taken out a film that I had put in, Jan Švankmajer's Rakvičkarna, The Coffin Factory, sometimes known as Punch and Judy. And I've taken that out because it was getting me a copyright claim, and I got so many views on it. Had I not gotten that copyright claim, gee, if I had been monetizing it, or in the future if I had, I would be getting money on it. But instead, somebody else is. So, and it's only a very small part of the video. So the other thing is, I wanted to add something, so I've taken that away, but I've also added a couple of things. So one of the things I've added is I have added a description of some of my puppet activities since that lecture, which was in 2012. So that's been a while, so that's one thing, just to kind of keep you up to date with what I have been doing at the very end. But also I've added all the questions and answers that we're at. So this one's actually both shorter and longer than the original version over on the Anadromous Life. If you want to see the other puppet video, you can either go over there and watch that version, or, which is roughly the same except for it, and you can also, I'll put a link here so you can see the Švankmajer video on YouTube somewhere. So anyway, without any further ado, this is Byrne Power, the Anadromous, saying, let's go. Let's listen to Puppetry as an Antidote Art, or as I'm retitling it, Puppetry in the 21st Century.
You've been travelling Europe for how long now?
Over a month.
Over a month, doing research on
Puppets.
puppets.
Yes.
So, nice to have you. Thank you for being with us, and tell us more.
Okay.
Anything you want to tell us?
Okay. I'll let everyone finish settling down. Although, I suppose the big question, it's been reflected in quite a few of my initial comments on the subject. As soon as someone here seems to hear I'm doing puppets, the next question out of their mouth is kind of like, why? And the whole lecture is kind of an answer to that question, which is why I've been sometimes a little cagey as to explaining it all, because I knew I was going to explain it all here. So, but it is, you have to admit, it is kind of an odd thing. There's several more seats up here. By way of preface, we are going to watch a film called, the actual name of the film in Czech is called Rakvičkarna, which translates directly into The Coffin Factory. although it's often called, when this appears on certain DVDs by Jan Švankmajer, it appears as Punch and Judy. Although in fact, the characters in it aren't quite Punch or Judy. But nevertheless, it has that sort of thing. And one of the things I want you to see in watching this film is I have actually probably watched this film at least 50 times, because in Alaska, every time there's anyone interested in puppetry, this is the film I show them, to show them that puppets can do an awful lot more than you think. Now, I've watched it about 50 times. I've never remotely gotten tired of it. And there are things that keep me coming back over and over and asking, what is this really about? And if you know anything at all about Punch and Judy shows, you know there's a lot of smashing and bashing of puppets. And Švankmajer uses this for, well, I'll let you come to your own conclusions as to what for. So I wanted to show you that because that's a good introduction into puppetry. And in fact, is one of the first things I saw that was kind of got me thinking like, At first it was just the films that interested me. And I thought, well, these are interesting films. I wonder if there are any more. But like most Americans, I started off with, my image of puppetry was something like this. Are there alphorns blowing? This is my, and most Americans that I know, introduction to puppetry, the Muppets. And the Muppets, I don't want to get into a diatribe about the Muppets at the moment, but the Muppets generally don't contain the same kinds of layers of depth that we just saw in that last film. There are some more interesting pieces, particularly in the earlier years. But like most Americans, these kind of cute, cuddly creatures is what I would think of as puppets. Puppets equal Muppets equals children. And so I always thought of puppets as being a children's art, or maybe a folk art at best. But once I discovered, by the way, King Kong was a puppet, the original King Kong. And a lot of the stop motion animation was another way in which, as an American, I came across puppetry. Although it didn't really occur to me until after I started studying puppetry that, if you go back and look at King Kong today, it's an amazing little puppet show. Particularly since now we have digital imagery. And there's something about the King Kong creation that looks so tactile versus digital variations on all of these things. It was the late 80s. The Film Forum in New York City was having a festival where they were showing films by Jan Švankmajer. Švankmajer is a Czech who, as I mentioned before, grew up in communist times. He's about 78 years old right now. When I first saw these films, I started saying to myself, there's something more going on here. And he's made a variety of films. He's recently made more full-length films that have more live human beings in them and such. Although the last film was called Surviving Life, which he made about 2 years ago, was featured mostly human beings as cutouts that he would animate. So in a sense, he turned the human being back into a puppet. And in a sense, he was making a comment on what's happening in the Czech Republic at the moment. That is to say that our consumerism is turning us back into puppets. And although I don't think he'd say the message quite as baldly as I did, I'm pretty sure that was behind it. Films. Now, what's interesting is that was primarily live with bits of animation in it. And so that's one of the reasons I show it to people, is because you really get a chance to see the puppets move around. What's also really interesting is that he shows the hands going into the puppet, which immediately lets you know everything else you're about to watch is just hands and a puppet and, a camera. So he's totally made it something that it's like he's defanged it, except it's just the opposite with puppetry. And that's the thing I began to discover over and over is you can tell people, you can stand next to the puppet, and eventually people will just be watching the puppet, not you, on a stage. But Švankmajer has a lot of imagery. This is from his Alice in Wonderland, and eventually all three of those Alices move in the picture. They are all Alice. The living one turns into the doll and wanders around for most of the film as a doll. But his films are sometimes disturbing and always thought-provoking and very interesting. And as I was in New York City about to leave, I kept thinking, this is also from his Alice in Wonderland, and in this one, the rabbit the first thing it does is it loses sawdust. It's stuffed with sawdust, so it's trying to sew itself up all the time. And it's actually, I am pretty sure that's a rabbit skin. And he is not the only one to do that kind of thing in these films. And the eyeballs themselves are kind of disturbing because they look like they were borrowed from someone who needed eyeballs. And he'll do things like that. That's the kind of, there's these odd juxtapositions of imagery. And yes, indeed, those are real scissors. And that's one thing that got me thinking. And as I started thinking about it, I started saying to myself, maybe there's more going on here than just the films. Maybe it comes from a tradition. This is Švankmajer himself a couple of years ago, basically the person I met on the trip. I also, around the same time, ran into the films of a couple of brothers. They're identical twins. They're known as the brothers Quay. They're actually from Philadelphia, and but they've been living in London for ages. And they're very inspired by Polish film work. And eventually they would go on to champion Jan Švankmajer and such. But they'd started doing these films before him. Their films also include a lot of imagery that just really causes you to ask what it is you're watching and why does it have the effect on you that it does. And I think that their work is also some of the most interesting and innovative puppet work. And again, with Jan Švankmajer, if you're going to watch it like a pleasant, like I know people who've picked up Jan Švankmajer's Alice thinking, I'm going to show this to the kids. And the kids are kind of going, and the parents are going, because it's not the happy-go-lucky kind of Disney Alice in Wonderland, or it's not even a Tim Burton Alice in Wonderland. It's odd, really odd. You have bones moving around that he's animating and stuff, which is, normally you don't show, but I think actually probably kids like it. But this is the brothers Quay here. This is actually them in the 1980s. They're about 65 now. And they would animate these creatures and spend hours and hours and hours doing each frame. But of course, as you see, what they're really animating is a puppet. And I think one of the definitions of a puppet film, as I started to understand it, is a film in which you know this is a puppet. Just as the hands go into the puppets here, you're never saying to yourself at one moment, this is a real creature. It's not like digital imagery where you're essentially asked to believe. So anyway, I then started to look into more puppet films and discovered the works of Jiří Trnka in the Czech Republic, who comes before Švankmajer. This one here is from 1964 as well. He was a very respected artist, particularly of children's movies with puppets, obviously. But this one was all about the role of the artist in the communist world. Although they didn't use communist imagery, it was quite clear. And the hand makes him do all these things. It keeps trying to make him, instead of he wants to make flower pots, it keeps trying to get him to make a hand. And everything is about these hands. He has to reproduce the hand. And in the end, the hand crushes him. And then he dies. And then he's celebrated as an artist who's a hero of the state. And these kinds of things, of course, did happen in communist times. And, of course, this was not a very subtle metaphor. But he was older. He'd become super respected. And he just basically decided to crash his whole career with this movie. The version that is on a DVD has some kind of bad sound quality, and I'm convinced it's because there's only one copy of the film left, the one that was not in the country at the time, because the communists made sure every other one. And this next is a picture of Mr. Trnka. Again, not the kind of guy you expect to work with your children. Another person, predating even Trnka, who was working in the 40s and 50s and 60s, is Ladislas Starevitch, who was a Polish-Russian director. And he was in Moscow in 1908. He made the first stop-motion animation films. he was also really interested in entomology and natural history. And so he made his first stop-motion animation films out of beetles. And one of the first films from, I think, 1911 is about the grasshopper and his wife. And it's all about the grasshopper's wife, and the grasshopper's wife is cheating on him with a beetle. So it's like, wait, this is not like a kid's story. I mean, and in the end, the grasshopper gets revenge. He has a camera and he films the beetle and the female grasshopper together and shows it to them in public and such. But it's just this crazy 1911 Russia. So Starevitch is really important. One of my favorite films. This one is from his Reynard the Fox. But he did one in 1933 called The Mascot in English, or Fetish in French. And it's an amazing film. It's like about 25 minutes long. And it's all about this stuffed dog that goes to try to find an orange to help its sick owner recover. And in the process, it ends up going through hell. And this satanic party, and all this stuff, all hell breaks loose. But he finally gets the orange back, cures the sick girl. It's like an amazing story. And it's kind of a kid's story, but the imagery in it is just wild, as this is. And this is Starevitch himself, looking a bit like a scientist almost. So I was starting to watch these, and then it kept occurring to me, there's something in puppetry that I'm not getting, and I would like to get. And so in 2000, I was passing through here, and on the way through, I went out further. I saw a puppet show in Vienna. I saw one in Romania. And then I went to the Czech Republic, where I saw this, which is the Don Giovanni that is kind of perpetually there. There are actually two Don Giovannis, but this is the official one at the National Marionnette Theater. And it's very classic Czech puppetry. And it was something that made me say, okay, this is really interesting. I also saw a couple of things that were more for tourists. But I said to myself, when I got back home, I said, I'm going to have to go back later and kind of look at this some more. And over the next 5 years, I started to think about it. One of the things I also saw during that time were things like this. This is a nativity scene. And in places like Poland, these things were animated. Some of the figures on them actually moved and were operated. And so and it turns out that the nativity play goes back into the church quite a ways, into the Middle Ages, as a puppet show. And this one here is actually a much more modern one. I actually just saw these puppets in the flesh, so to speak, well, in the wood. In Vienna, they're in the theater museum there, and they're by Richard Teschner. And Teschner would always do these nativity plays once a year. In fact, they're reproducing them this year. There's a Teschner scholar who's going to do a whole series of them through December. So if I were in Vienna in December, you'd know where to find me. But so there is a long tradition of these nativity plays in European puppetry, which I just find interesting. Around 2004, this was actually my first attempt at a puppet show here. And this is, it was the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, and we used this kind of thing, and then we had a full-size human being behind the screen, so it was kind of a shadow play. But it wasn't particularly exciting, but nevertheless, a group of friends enjoyed it. But I came back here in 2005, and after I was done at L'Abri, I decided to take 2 months or so to go around to different puppet theaters in Europe. I had kind of arranged this all ahead of time, and what I really wanted to do was interview and talk with people about puppetry. So one of the first places I went was to this theater in Parc Butte de Chaumont in Paris, and they have the Guignol show. And Guignol is this little character. This is the guy I met, Pascal. And it's this trip that I took that really kind of upped my game, so that I really started to understand puppetry a lot more. He would ring this bell, but he's the guignolist, and there's quite a few different ones of these in Paris, and also Lyon has quite a tradition of these, but they're slightly different, and I look forward to seeing the ones in Lyon soon. But nevertheless, the show comes on, and Guignol is the character over there, who's based upon a silk weaver in Lyon, because Lyon used to be the silk capital of Europe. And but he's kind of a rascally character. And what happens is, now, these shows are done for children, and one of the stock characters in these is the gendarme. And the gendarme at one point gets eaten by a crocodile. So, okay, well, that's kind of sad. And then Guignol decides to go fishing. And just as he reels his line in, the crocodile's snout comes up from behind him. And at that point, the kids kind of go insane. Unfortunately, I don't have the crocodile snout in here. And they start like pointing up and they say, Guignol, watch out. There's a crocodile behind you. And he looks, and of course, the crocodile's not there. And then he goes back, and then they see the snout again, and they just go insane. I was thinking to myself, there's this whole thing about interactivity, the web and everything, and it's just like, computer stuff. And I'm going, no. This is interactivity. Because this is like, and I went on to ask him, I said, one of the questions I asked is, I said, this is back in the studio and some of the figures that were there, I asked him, do you think children have changed over the years with all the computers and screens and all the video games and stuff? And he goes, absolutely. And I said, well, do you think puppets still work? Does Guignol still work for children? He goes, more than ever. I said, why? He says, when they first come, he says, I can always tell the kids who've never been here before, because the Guignol stage is not much bigger than some of our big television screens. And they want to somehow control it. But there's nothing to press. And in fact, the puppet can talk to them. And in fact, the puppet does talk to them. And in fact, sometimes he would use the puppet to, like if there was a kid being rowdy, the puppet would say something to him. So it was actually communicating directly to the children. And so, in a sense, I saw this kind of reality principle here. That one of the interesting things about puppets, a real puppet show is kind of like intimate. It's small. They're usually small. I have a whole thought about large puppets and spectacle and such, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But usually a puppet show is small, might take place on a stage like back there, and you wouldn't want many more people than you could fit into this building involved. Maybe half of them even would be better, so they could all see what was going on. So in other words, it's a small, intimate affair, and there's a sense of like, you can just touch that thing. And of course, that's exactly what the kids want to do. Is they like, and they jump up. So that was like the first thing that I saw that really sparked a new thought in me. And Guignol just celebrated 200 years back in 2008. And Guignol turns out to be a relative of a large tribe of puppets. And what it is that pretty much almost every country in Europe, Switzerland being an exception, has a specific puppet for their country that's kind of a rascally character. The reason Switzerland probably doesn't is because linguistically it's divided up in three. So the Germans probably get Caspero, and the French probably get Guignol, and the Italians probably get Punchinello or something like that. Punchinello is the original. He was a commedia dell'arte, stock masked character, often seen in Carnival time in Europe. And there's a whole series of these stock characters. But Punch, the English Punch, who is actually, I hate to say it, much more important than Judy, who usually gets killed in these affairs. And one of the things about Punch is the most insane out of all of them, which may have something to do with the English kind of calm, steady sort of demeanor about themselves, at least traditionally, prior to soccer and all the rest of that. But the English have always had sort of a tamp down, but Punch does everything you're not supposed to do. So in a Punch show, you have what is it? It's like Punch kind of like is told to watch the baby, but the baby is crying, and finally he just kills the baby. And then the wife, Judy, comes back and it's like, well, what happened to the baby? And he's like, he's dead, And then he ends up killing her. And then he ends up getting arrested by the policeman, but he probably kills the policeman. And then he gets sometimes he kills the executioner. Sometimes he goes to hell and kills the devil. Punch is, in a sense, a badass. By the way, this dog is part of the traditional Punch show. And the dog is always called Toby.
Toby's whole job is to sit on the edge of the little proscenium and do nothing while all this mayhem breaks out on the stage, which is really funny. And you can see what Švankmajer did in his little movie, that Toby was the guinea pig. Was that a guinea pig or a hamster? Thank you. I always thought it was, but you never know, these little chinchilla type things. So Punch, now what's interesting is, look at Punch though from a different perspective. You're like lower class, you haven't got a lot of entertainment, you go to this thing, there's people kind of pressing on you from all sorts of ways, but you can't react to it. You can't react to, the different rules of your society. Your wife nags at you, but you really can't do anything about it. Your baby is screaming, but you really can't do anything about it. The police are after you, but you really can't do anything about it. But Punch does it all. So it's this very interesting social mechanism. By the way, I once did a Punch and Judy show in Alaska as part of the stuff that I ended up doing. The only time I ever got really in trouble with people watching it. Which I thought was great, because it was like the most traditional. I still laugh about that today. It's like we did the absolutely most traditional puppet show, and people were like, this is not politically correct, to which the answer is, I think that's the point. So, but there's lots of these characters. They are different degrees. This is a Kasparek from the Czech Republic. So is the next one. That's Jan Švankmajer's Kasparek from his Don Juan puppet film. But actually, the Punch in the other one was actually kind of a Kasparek too. And the other one, the figure in the Coffin Factory, was kind of a Pagliacci character, or Harlequin as a character from the Commedia dell'arte. So this is Petrushka in Russia. The Greeks and the Turks have one that's kind of Karagoys. I'm not sure how it's exactly pronounced. But there's like Jan cheese or something like that, and there's Hanswurst, and there's Kasparov, and there's so many of these different guys in different countries. So it's an interesting thing, and it's definitely here. You see something absolutely, like the puppets can be used for the nativity plays. There are passion plays with puppets and such. But here you have the archetype of just the opposite. It's like this is your extremely profane character. But nevertheless, I think he serves a very interesting function in the world. My next stop on this trip was to Charleville-Mézières in France, where I went to the École Nationale Supérieure des Arts de la Marionnette, which is kind of inside out, nicknamed ESNAM. I always thought it should be ENSAM. Anyway, in Charleville-Mézières, there are several things going on at once. One, it's the headquarters for the international organization for puppetry called UNIMA. Also, the word marionnette in French, marionnette, means all puppets. Unlike in English, the word marionette means just stringed puppets. And also, it's the International Institute of Marionettes, and the school is related to it. The school's really interesting. They only take 15 students every 3 years. They pay for everything for them, of course, except for the tryouts. You've got to get there yourself. What's interesting, though, is you don't actually have to have gone to college or anything. What you have to do is prove you've had some puppetry experience, speak French, and perform on the spot something they give you. They give you like a day or so to come up with something, giving you some sort of thing to do. So those are the 3 requirements. And the 15 people who do that end up going to the school for 3 years through a course of programs. And when I came here, I didn't know what to expect, really. But what I saw just completely redefined everything I thought about puppetry. And one of the things, this particular girl, Julia Kovacs, was from Hungary. And she did this story where she started off, she was standing way at the end of this hall. And she had this like bag with her. And she started saying these words in French about where does war come from? Why is there bloodshed? These kinds of things. Asking these kind of deeper philosophical questions. And then what she does is she comes forward and places these kind of broken marionettes on pedestals, and finally ends up with these 2, a man and a woman, obviously unfinished. And they start having this discussion, and the woman starts saying something like this. I'm really afraid. It just seems like there's so much war and violence in the world, and I just don't know what to do about it. It just doesn't seem right. And the man says, you're right. It isn't a good thing, and basically, but this is the world we find ourselves living in, and we have to get used to it. And the woman says, yeah, but it's really not right. I mean, it just seems just completely wrong. And the guy goes, I know it's not right, but basically, you're going to have to just get used to it. This is the way the world goes. And then finally she says, but I'm really afraid. And it ends with the two of them like this. The woman is crouching, and the other puppet, I wish I'd gotten that image. The other puppet is crouching over her, about to beat her. And then she stops, and she goes, where does war come from? And where does bloodshed come from? And in a sense, she brings it right back to us. Now, I saw this twice. I wanted to kind of record it on this audio recorder that I had. But I was just like so taken in by it that I couldn't even remember to turn on the thing. And it was just her standing there the whole time with this. I got her to do this afterwards. But it was just a very powerful piece, which showed me that at that point I thought puppets can do pretty much anything. Maybe they can't do the psychological realism that actors can do, but as far as getting across any sort of idea, they aren't just for children. And that became really clear to me. This was another show that I saw, and this was a Romanian girl named Aurelia Ivan, who's now in Paris, and I'm going to see her again. Those things on the floor there are actually little walnuts, and she's reading off of this list of the attributes of a great knight of France. Jean the Sagesse, and Jean this and John that. But finally he's Jean le Mort, John the Dead. And then she starts taking out these little, what they actually are is grapevines that have been trimmed, but she makes them into roots, and each one has a face, and as she's pulling them out, she does each voice with them, and they're putting them into the ground, and each voice is saying, oh, this feels so good, and there's a little baby one that says, I'm hungry, and what they're doing is eating John the Dead. And essentially, the whole thing is a treatise on the nature of death and such. I mean, philosophically, it's not from my position, but nevertheless, it was quite interesting. And she did things like she had like lights on the end of her wrists, and she made these grape branches grow, but just the shadows. So you got the idea of it's gross. And the last thing she did is, as you left, she handed you a walnut. And it really made you, it was kind of like I said, I didn't particularly philosophically agree with the whole thing, but I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. She's actually doing a show now about people becoming androids. So she's made a full-sized android kind of armature and everything, but it has left it kind of blank and empty, but she made a life mask of her own face to put on it. And it's really a comment on where we're going. So and that's another thing I started to learn. And she introduced me to this guy who was standing around afterwards with her, this guy named François Lazaro. He used to be a teacher there. I couldn't actually interview any of the teachers while I was there because they were actually grading these student performances, and so it wasn't a good time. But he had been one of the professors there, and he was also had been doing things since the early 70s. And so I had a very interesting discussion with him as well. And again, as I'm processing this, I'm saying to myself, this is really fascinating. It's just like, this is an art form that really can go all over the place. And I don't think most people understand this. So I moved on from there to Germany, where I went to Berlin. I was actually visiting a friend, but there were several puppet theaters in Berlin. And I went to this one, could you pronounce this for us?
Schattentheater.
Thank you. The Shadow Theater. But it's the figure circle, or the Figuren-Circle. Is that close enough? So, but the interesting thing now, this is the only image I have of what it looks like from the front when you're watching it. And in fact, it's in a circle, which was actually after this guy Richard Teschner in Austria had also worked with a circle, except he worked with three-dimensional puppets. But these were all shadow puppets. Now what's fascinating is I was pretty convinced there were 2 or 3 people behind there. But it was only this one Austrian guy named Georg Jentsch. And I went and talked to him, and he showed me essentially how he did it. He even had one shadow puppet that was not a shadow puppet, it was a light puppet. And what he did was he had like a piece of instead of the black stuff, he had a piece of like reflective silver stuff that he would shine a light on it and get it. It was an angel that would fly. So, just also, as you can see, there's just this whole thing with very fascinating just a use of imagination. That's one of the things that was always striking me. It's just like endless variations on things nobody's ever thought about, it seems. These kinds of, how to use imagery. I also went to this theater, Die Schaubude, which is like a repertory theater, as it says on top, for puppets, figures, and object theater. And I went back there again this time. But at that point, there was a group that was doing, actually, this was one of the funniest things ever. It finally proved to me once and for all that Germans have a sense of humor. Because it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. Just as a puppet show or anything, I was just like, I didn't even understand German. My friend would occasionally, but I didn't need to. They were so funny. This woman over here, every time she'd hear bad news, she'd be like, oh, but they were really fascinated. It was Ingrid and Torsten, and they were both doing this back in the communist times in East Berlin. And this is when I started, in a sense, I had crossed the border into where I was really trying to get to, which was what had been going on back in the communist days with puppetry. Because I knew from Švankmajer that the puppets were communicating an awful lot more than just a little simple morality tale or a story for children or something like that. And what they told me is that during the communist times, people would fill these theaters because they would look and they would watch. Sometimes they would read too much into what they were watching, but sometimes what they sometimes did is they would submit their scripts, but then they would change the images. So one really particularly bold move, they had the winter uniform of the Stasi or something like that as part of their characters, which immediately was like everyone in the audience got it, but was still like, whoa, are we really doing this? This was near the end of the communist era. So from them, I really learned, what it was like. Now, of course, there was an interesting thing that happened. As soon as the wall came down, suddenly all the American movies and all the American music, everything just flooded in. And there was a period where it's like, who needs puppets? We can go and watch Lord of the Rings now. It's like, whoa, this is all big stuff. And in fact, you go across Europe today, and everywhere you go, there's huge, amazing, digital blasting epics, the same kind of things you'd see in America, exactly the same kind of things. In fact, the same things. So, but I went from there to Poland. I had trouble finding a puppet theater in Poland because I was looking for, when you think puppet theater, you think of something kind of small. And this is generally what puppet theaters in Poland look like. Because the Russians came in and told them the following thing after World War II. There are 4 types of culture. You must have these. 1, ballet. 2, opera. 3, theater. And for the children and other people, puppets. And so the flip side of this one is the theater, and then there's 2 more, and that's the huge Stalinist Gothic monument in the middle of Warsaw. But essentially, that's what every puppet theater I have seen in Poland looks like a bank. It just is this massive building. It's like a state, it's like the courthouse or something. It's just amazing. I went to one called the Teatr Groteska in Krakow, where they had these strange, dark puppets. And they were actually on the end of actors' hands, and the actors would sometimes be themselves and sometimes be the puppets. It was a really fascinating show. But look how these are made with like burlap and the textures. And another thing I'd like to point out is if you remember back to the Švankmajer film, think of all the textures in there. And you could practically touch that film. It that's one of the things that keeps you watching it over and over. Apart from trying to figure out what he's actually saying, it's just the density, the layers of textures in that are so incredible. And Švankmajer and many of these people have thoughts about the tactility of puppets, how they should be something you should touch, in fact. Not only the puppeteers, but sometimes the group I saw in the Czech Republic, Buchty a loutky, which means cakes and puppets, let people come up afterwards and play with the puppets and touch them. So From here, I went. This was actually in the backstage. This is one of the closets where they store things. One of the principles I learned is if there's any way to get yourself in the warehouse where they keep all the old puppets, go, because that's where there's tons of interesting stuff there. But again, this is obviously not. This is not the kind of puppet show you'd say, "Come on, we're going to the puppet show." This is obviously something serious going on here, and it doesn't surprise me that Krakow isn't that far from Auschwitz either. So it's kind of like these very. I mean, they kind of look like nice puppets, except what's that one over there? Doesn't it like some sort of bruised puppet? And it's just a very. There's a lot going on with these images. This was the director Adam Veltschek of the Teatr Groteska, and I talked to him, and I said at one point, because I'd been talking with these Germans, I said, "So let me guess, you handed in Poland the censors are really strict." And he says you handed it in, and then you'd hand in the script, but then they'd hand it back to you, and they really didn't understand the imagery, and so you would just kind of change the imagery, and he goes like, "Yeah." Just kind of like, of course we did. It was just, it's almost like it became a game. I actually was talking to one of the people, actually this thought surfaced several times. Why was that such a fruitful time? And the reason is because they had something to kick against. That, so much, I think our art kind of fails because we don't have any direction for it. And at this point, they really had a direction for it. And so they really had to become good to get across whatever they were trying to get across in this kind of very clamped down situation. This is a picture. This is a Don Giovanni. Sorry. This is a Faust from the Puppet Museum in Chrudim in the Czech Republic. But of course, this is the CSSR, the Czechoslovakian Socialist Republic. And this was like a postcard that they were trying desperately to get rid of because, obviously they are no longer the Socialist Republic. But this museum was really fascinating. And I also spoke with the museum director who gave me, her name was Alina Exnerova. She gave me a complete history and a book to go with it. I started getting books from people after a while. This happened on this trip too, that it got so heavy that I just was given a book this thick and this wide, autographed by the author, back in Warsaw. And I was like, okay, thank you. And I was like, oh, I'm so happy. And my back was just, oh. So I had to mail that back and spend basically the equivalent of $70 to mail it back. But she gave me a whole history of the puppetry in the Czech Republic. He took me around this guy's named DRAK. Took me around, showed me the back rooms and such of the, and what the picture that started to come to me about puppetry in the Czech Republic is they started too with the nativity plays and miracle plays as puppetry. Eventually, though, they got the people who really brought puppetry to them were the English and the Dutch and the Germans. And the English were doing things like short versions of Shakespeare plays. They did Macbeth, and they did Hamlet, and they did some other plays. So these were done, though, in kind of shortened versions in Czech. Now, what happened in 1620 is the Austro-Hungarian Empire finally said, what had really happened was the Czech Republic had revived their Jan Hus early Protestantism. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire said, enough of this. And finally, in 1620, you had this, it's called the Battle of White Mountain, totally crushed the Czech rulers. And then Czech was banned. And only German was allowed in all forms of education. And so you couldn't use Czech in any kind of education, any kind of public thing. It was only German, which is why Franz Kafka, a Czech, writes in German, because that tradition kept on for a long time. But puppet shows, for instance, were done in Czech because they were kind of like below the line. It wasn't the only thing that kept the language alive. There were quite a few things, but it was certainly one of the things, one of many things. Later, the Kashbarek character, who's kind of this, rascally Punch-like character, but not quite as sinister as Punch, would often be saying things about the Austro-Hungarians, about the Habsburgs. And so it was kind of like these coded messages were slipped through. Later, there was like a whole thing during the Nazi era where puppeteers were actually doing these shows that were getting them in trouble. One guy, Jan Malik, who was a great puppeteer, documents that over 100 puppeteers were killed by the Nazis. And in fact, including the greatest one, had his puppets actually arrested. Because they were so worried about what these puppets symbolized for the Czechs. It's the only place in the world probably where puppets have taken on this really heroic kind of cast. And then later, during the communist period, all these messages were smuggled through with puppetry as well. So I moved on from there. Oh, this is one of the skeletons in the Czech Puppet Museum. And skeletons show up all the time in Czech art. And the way it's explained to me is this, is that skeletons don't simply mean death. Whenever you see a skeleton in Czech art, it also is a warning. And it says, think about how you live, because eventually you will be me. So it has this meaning. It's like when you see a skeleton, it's like, think about it. How are you living? And that's kind of what the skeleton means. So it's not just a symbol of horror. It's also a symbol of questioning. So you see the skeletal image over and over. The next place I went to was this theater called DRAK, which means dragon, but it also has a longer, it's an acronym in Czech. I've heard it as Theater of Love and Joy, but there's another one that's probably closer to the heart of it. And this, for instance, is from their, just some older puppets from their show of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which they call Krizarsh. And I never really saw the Pied Piper as kind of a good figure before until I saw this one Czech puppet movie about it, where you suddenly realize, oh, he's come to save them from the rats, and they're greedy and won't pay him. So finally, in the end, he takes the children. And in some versions of the story, he just takes them away because essentially the people aren't worthy of it because they have no gratitude in their hearts for anyone. So it's an interesting, and a lot of these old stories like Don Juan or Don Giovanni, Faust, the Pied Piper of Hamelin make amazing puppet stories because they lend themselves to all sorts of metaphorical reinterpretations and stuff. This was Jakob Krafft, whom I again met on this time. He was the director of DRAK at the time. His father, Josef Krafft, actually started the thing. This is actually a puppet that, as a full-size puppet that someone was dancing with, that represents the Habsburg Empire. And, oh, how did he get there? Actually, I was traveling with them for one of their shows. On this, it was probably the scariest auto trip I have ever had in my life. I was in their van traveling with them, and the Czech roads. Later, I found a book saying, indeed, the Czechs have the worst driving statistics in Europe because of all the beer and the weird narrow roads, and the fact that I saw the following when I was traveling with these guys. A car came from about 3 or 4 cars behind us, past 4 or 5 cars in front of us, as a semi-truck was coming straight there, and only at the last possible second to go, and there was no room to pull off, and I was just, anyway, that's just the kind of trip it was. But these guys were great, and I actually met this guy, Philip, again, when he was there, and some other people who were involved with this. I saw them when I was just back there, and they were saying, you remember us? I go like, how can I forget? But they would also do these things that are kind of like combining mime, circus, puppetry, all sorts of stuff like that. But finally I got back to Prague, and Prague being kind of like the central, there's an awful lot of puppet stuff going on in Prague, including occasionally you'll find a store like this that has really, really good and here's the way you know how, expensive puppets. These, because they're carved by real artists who do puppets. And but they also have tons of cheap imitation puppets like these. These are like, pick one of these up for $30 or so. But they're not meant to be good puppets. And in fact, most of these are run by Bulgarians and Serbians and stuff who came in to kind of cash in on, including this one. This is the fake Don Giovanni. The most interesting part of it is the outdoor awning there. But the carvings outside. The actual puppets are not that interesting. They also have a lot of these black light theaters, which occasionally use puppetry as well. They're often done for tourists. But This is Loutky magazine, which is the oldest puppetry magazine in the world. Just this year it turned 100. And they kind of track puppetry in the Czech Republic and in other countries as well, but primarily in the Czech Republic. And this was the group, Buchty a loutky, that I saw that really just completely changed my whole vision of puppetry once again. I'd seen all this other stuff and I was quite impressed, but these guys really was like, whoa, where is this coming from? And this version is Baskervilski's, Pes Baskervilski's, which means the Hound of the Baskervilles. And this was their version of that story. And in fact, they did things like, this is where they go crazy. They had a version of Rocky, the movie, called Rocky 9. While I was there, I watched Psycho Reloaded, which was their version of the Alfred Hitchcock movie Psycho. The one I'm really regretting that I'm missing is the one called Lynch, which is based on the works of David Lynch. I would love to have seen what on earth they did with that. I also saw recently their King Arthur variation, and all of these things are just completely mind-boggling. These are the people involved, and this is how they set things up. So it looks like they just dragged some stuff out of the backyard, particularly in this one. And you'll notice some blood stains on there because they kill one of the characters and have stage blood run off of every show, and they just leave it there. But let me show you something here. So up here is a stage. Right here is a stage. Right here is a stage. Sometimes these are used for shadows. They also have live musicians playing in the back. So in this particular one, a little puppet walks out onto this little stage. There's a little bed there. And he's got a little bottle in his hand. He drinks and he falls asleep. And the rest is his dream. I was just like, okay, you've got me. This is just like incredible. So this is where most of the action will take place. But sometimes, like there's one point where someone passes someone a gun. You see two human hands. One passes a gun over to someone else here. This is like for close-ups. So what they've done is they've taken movie kind of techniques and applied them to puppetry. And in fact, when I asked them, who's your main influence? They all say the same thing, Švankmajer. So they are the first like post-Švankmajer puppet troupe. So there you go. This is like the bleeding stage. And if you look at it, it's just completely funky. But that's what makes this really work. It's so funky that it really... I mean, look, they just drag this out of like someone's backyard, some industrial waste product. Or this one where... what was great about this is a mermaid, so they're putting her in. This is before the show. Later, they fill it with water, and they blow through a clear tube behind her. And so when she's talking, you see bubbles coming out. And what I said to them this time, I got to know them a lot better this time, is I said, it's like you guys have figured out how to make amazing works of imagination for absolutely no money. And they said, that's the way it works. That's what it's all about. But they have this whole thing, and of course, you see the textures. And these guys really are working against the modern, shiny mall aesthetic. It's just like the really cool, chic way people are supposed to act and dress. These guys are just completely the opposite. They are funky, low down. Their stuff is just, it's very funny sometimes, but it really makes interesting points at others. They're quite unusual. The last place I went on my trip was to Salzburg, Austria, and saw the Marionnette Theater there. And the Marionnette Theater, this is actually from their museum. I didn't actually take any pictures during the production because I didn't feel like I had the permission to. But there's like 9 strings on each of their marionettes. Some of these have less. I did see this. This was the Nutcracker, which I saw on May 1st. Someone will have to explain to me how that works in Europe someday. But I always thought it was more of a Christmas thing myself. But anyway, I saw this on May 1st. And but all of these crazy things that were happening. This was one of the characters also in the Nutcracker. And most of the human puppets have 9 strings. These are like, learning these kinds of puppets is like learning the piano. It is so complex and so hard to learn. I mean, I've got a puppet with 9 strings at home. It's a bit clunkier as in design than these. But it takes a long time to learn it. And these people really have their technique down. Now the thing is, they do these things, this is also from the museum, they do them to pre-recorded opera. So I was watching the Nutcracker, they've also done most of Mozart's opera repertoire, and they do other things as well. I highly recommend them. But I'd seen all of these things, and the thing that the Buchty people, the cakes and puppet people in Prague convinced me of is, we can do this back in Alaska. We got lots of stuff hanging around, and people with way too much time sometimes. Let's go. I'm going to go back and get some people to do this. So that's exactly what I did. We went back and these are just some of the posters, which don't necessarily reflect the puppets. But this is the building we did a lot of our shows in. It was just this old log cabin. And what I decided is I couldn't just simply do the European style show. I had to have some sort of framework for it that would get people's attention. So what I did was I called it the Lilliputian Puppet Sideshow. And so you walk into a room maybe half this big, and there's these cages all around you. And I would have each person make their own sideshow attraction. And then we'd have one MC, master of ceremonies, who would, introduce each act. And we might have 10, 15 acts, depending on the year, depending on the show. And what was great is we were always throwing people off. But it was all done kind of in the Buchty style. Everyone that was in my puppet thing just went through what you just went through. And in order to start, you had to be indoctrinated into puppetry. And there was a lot more that they got as well. But one of the things I was really convinced of is that we needed live music. So this guy was hanging around in the back. He's actually our town doctor. He's my doctor. He's educated at Johns Hopkins University. If you know anything about American medicine, you know that's pretty much the best university. But anyway, he also likes the accordion, and I have this weird, funky instrument that he was able to play. When people would walk in, they would see this kind of stuff hanging around on the sides of the walls. We kind of funnel people in all these blankets and stuff, so they wouldn't know where they were. The musician was not readily available like that. He was just kind of off on the side. And so people would come in and they would end up sitting. Actually, what these people are looking at is something that's happening outside of one of the windows. We suddenly opened one of the windows and things were happening outside, and then closed it again. But they never knew where to turn or where to look. And so this is something that one of our other puppeteers made. That's something a friend of mine, Karsten, made. His sister was actually at Labrie back in Malay back in 1993. But he kind of got the idea. And so he was really fascinated by shadow puppets. So I let him do that. This is something I did, is I found these dried salmon heads. And then I painted them and made a two-headed salmon creature with fur. It was called the Serpentine Bicephalus. This is, someone else did this one, and it was all about the kind of the bizarreness of fashion and such. And so this little puppet, obviously it's a doll that's been reconfigured Buchty style. But then all the little stuff, miniature magazines and things, it's just brilliant. This one is great. Another guy, Gene, came up with this idea. These are, of course, can dancers. And what hot tomatoes they are. This one, essentially, it's aluminum foil, a little bit of clay, and, I don't know, are those marbles in the eyes? It was an alien. This is one I did. And this one was a little bit more serious. This one was done during a November show, so it wasn't. But it had to do with the reflection in the mirror and stuff like that. At this point, this was a few years later, I was like, okay, we can push it and get more serious now. Now that they've got the basic concept, Puppets Not for Kids. This was another one of mine as well. And kind of based on the Rapunzel story. Although in this version it's a comedy, I did another one where it wasn't quite as comic. And this was one of mine too. It was a mud puppet. And it comes out of the mud. This is not the actual setting of it, but this is just hanging up, and I took a photo of it because I was too busy getting muddy to actually take photos of it at the time. So that gave you an idea of the kind of things we did with the Lilliputian Puppet Sideshow. But I was getting a little bit, it's kind of like that was almost getting too easy for me. So, and I noticed also, most of the people that I had brought on board kind of were of a certain mindset. I think they wanted to do more funny things. It's one of the temptations with puppetry. I wanted to do things, I don't mind funny things, but I wanted to do things that were also pushing the limits of the form a bit more. So we divided up at this point, and they became the Geppetto's Junkyard. And I became, along with my friend Karsten and some other people, Reckoning Motions. And so in this case, this was specifically a Christian show. But every now and then I'll meet someone who's a Christian, and I say I do puppets, and they'll go like, "Oh, really? Do you have a puppet ministry?" And the answer is, no, I don't. I don't look at it that way at all. I look at it as art. I look at it as communication. I look at it as something that people haven't seen before. So we took this show and went for 2 months. I got a grant, and we went for 2 months around America with it. And we went, Watson Lake is a small native village in Yukon Territories in Canada. We went to a rock club in New York. We went to a fundamentalist high school in Florida. We went to an anarchist art collective in Oakland, California. We played in someone's backyard in Dallas. We played in a living room for Reed students in Oregon. We played at a classical Christian academy in Minnesota. We played at in a coffee shop with a drive-in window in South Carolina. So anyway, we played in all sorts of bizarre places. We had as many as 600 people at one of our shows, as little as 2 in another. So, but the thing, we didn't make any money on this show. But what I learned was that what we were doing was something that communicated. And people would come up to us and they would say, I've never seen anything like this before. So we basically drove around in this van, and we made our stuff. The story was based, it was called The Great Ziggurat, which is based on the Tower of Babel. And we did the original story, but we did various towers through history. So one tower is kind of like the Middle Age. One was the Roman era, one was the Middle Ages, one was the modern period, the final one was the postmodern era, in which we used tinker toys to express the flimsiness of the tower we are now constructing. But this was actually a puppet I had commissioned for the project. Since I'd gotten this grant, I had a Czech carver make one and send it to me. And I'm actually going to meet her on this trip. And I based it on the actual historical character responsible for the Great Ziggurat, who is Sargon. He's called, in some places, the same character that most people believe is Nimrod. And there's a mask of Sargon. And so I gave her photos of the mask, and I said, and I want those blank eyes like the mask, you know. And if you go to Iraq today, chances are not many of you are going there in the near future, but if you were to, if you go to the old site of Babylon, right next to is something that looks like a mountain, but it's not. It's the Great Ziggurat. It's the bottom part of it. So it's very interesting. But we also did things, we used all sorts of tower imagery from other things, like Rapunzel, climbing up the hair, or the movie Vertigo, Jimmy Stewart pushing Kim Novak out the window, or King Kong, all showed up at different times. We had lots of stuff going on. These were some of the puppets we had. You'll notice the one over in the corner near the big red fist, which did represent communism, was actually a Justin Timberlake action figure that we turned into Stalin. The next one next to it was the Hitler figure that was some sort of swashbuckling character from an action thing. And then that's Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak. That's a DNA coil there. That cross kind of represented, originally, the first part of the cross represented like the old Christianity, but then it eventually gets put on top of this kind of shinier thing to represent medieval Christianity, and it turns into this like golden cross. That's like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the actual action figure over there, who does show up in it. So we just threw stuff out. We also had, for instance, at one point we had a dialogue between Edgar Allan Poe and Carl Gustav Jung. I had people coming up, and some guy goes, "Oh, was that Faulkner?" And they go, "No, that was Edgar Allan Poe." And he turns to the guy, "I told you!" But we purposely, my thought in doing this was, let's not dumb anything down. Let's not shoot so everyone understands what we're doing. Let's do what you do if you want your kids to learn and read and such. You read slightly over their head and make them jump up for it. So we threw in, knowing Americans are very weak in history, we threw in tons of historical references to things. And people would come up afterwards and say things like, one girl said, "That really disturbed me I said, why? He says, well, I could tell you were trying to get us to think, but you weren't telling us how. And I said, exactly. That was the point. I wasn't trying to simply convert people. My feeling is before anyone can think about something like the gospel, you have to first be able to think. And we live in a time of such distraction and such that I felt with this particular piece, there's something going on in it that I think would, when we did this for Christians, they could kind of see something Christian going on. But that wasn't really the point. The point was really to puzzle people into thinking. And so when we did this at this classical Christian academy for high school students in Rochester, Minnesota, the kids all just sat there afterwards had no idea what was happening. And then they just started all raising their hands, going, what was that thing there? And what was that thing there? And I was just like, great. But actually the questions happened in a totally secular environment in the University of Chicago, too. It wasn't, it was just like people were puzzled by what we were doing. And but they enjoyed it. They could feel that there was a narrative. This was from a shadow puppet my friend Karsten did. And these were Nimrod's dreams. And the subject of the dreams was about the nature of language. That's what Karsten was doing. And so, and we just kind of tacked all this together, all this series of stuff. So much was going on, people would be wondering. One person came up and says, I'm so glad to see something that's not digital. Another girl in Oregon came up to us afterwards and said, I didn't know you could do that with puppets. I'm going home tonight and start working on them. And I kicked myself for not having gotten some information just so I could get in touch with her again and see, how are you doing with that, So there's our Empire State Building, another tower. This is our final tower, and this is the four of us who were on the trip. And playing with toys, essentially. So essentially what we see, just kind of wrapping it up here, is that what I've come to understand is that puppetry is an amazing art form that can do quite a bit. Much more than most people have any conception of. It's like when you start putting this all together, you start realizing, wow, this is an American woman. Actually, no, I take it back. She's Canadian from the early part of the 20th century. And very delicate puppet work. Or this is a strange creature that was actually an automaton. That is, an automaton is kind of like a puppet that is a wind-up thing that goes over and over. But this is called the automaton chess player, or the Turk. And before the show, they would always go and open up all the cabinets and show people that there was nobody in there. And then he would play. And he played Ben Franklin and won. And he played Napoleon and won. And Napoleon was so mad, he just knocked all the chess pieces off. But in fact, the automaton chess player was a puppet. Because there was a very midgetoid person inside there who was also an extremely gifted chess player. And that was always the secret. So, it's quite fascinating. Of course, ventriloquism is puppetry. And ventriloquism is also, some of us were talking about this the other day, one of the forms of puppetry that probably breeds the most fear. More horror films have been done about ventriloquist dummies, because it's the whole thing of who's actually in control here. There's just something about that. You find puppets also in pretty much every culture. This is actually something very rare. In my area, we have the Tlingit Indians. This is a very rare example of Tlingit puppetry. Unfortunately, no one in my town even knows anything about it. It was taken and put in the museum, Natural History Museum in New York. But you'll notice there's a thing inside of there that opens up and there's a face inside. This is actually constructed of bone and sinew. So, you find puppetry all over the world doing all sorts of very interesting things. This is from Africa, a mask. Interestingly enough, you ask, what is the origin of puppetry? Well, the origin of puppetry goes back to the origin of a lot of imagery, which is to say, into the religious realm. In some ways, they were used as idols. That is to say, in some cultures, there would be the priest who would manipulate these things. And in fact, in the church, sometimes there were living statues and such done on the same sort of principle. There's something about puppets, the way someone expressed it to me is you can't really read them the way you can read, say, a human face. And so it breeds a certain sort of mystery. There's also a comic part of them. They're also related on another side to dolls and toys. And it's not one definition of puppetry. The difference between puppet and a doll or a toy is the doll or the toy you play with in your own private fantasy world. But as soon as you turn it around and start playing for somebody else, then it's a puppet. So this is an African mask, which is part of a puppet show, which is still used in certain religious ceremonies, particularly in Mali. This is Indonesian shadow puppetry, which is also based on very similar Chinese shadow puppetry, which is actually more spectacular, but I don't have a picture of it here. But also used very much for religious reasons in Indonesia. And they often do 8-hour puppet shows that people will sit through with the gamelan music and such. They're quite interesting. In fact, in Indonesia, I'd heard that for a while there was a whole television channel that did nothing but show puppetry. This is Bunraku in Japan, which is probably the most complex puppetry on earth. The man standing behind it is one of 3 operators for this single puppet. His face is emotionless the whole time while he's holding this puppet. There may be another man next to him also holding a puppet, but everything goes into the puppet. There's also one figure, you probably can't make it out, there's a kind of a shadow of a person who operates the right hand and the head. The other person operates the left hand and the torso, and the third person moves the legs. And to graduate from the leg to the head takes something like 25 years. And that's how complicated these things are to learn. In New York City, I saw this, Vietnamese water puppets, which actually come out of the water. And they have a screen, and they have these very long poles with these long mechanisms, and they do all of these strange things, but it's puppetry performed in water. What I love about puppetry also is it can totally violate any notion of the proscenium arch. You know, that kind of rectangle that we find in movie theaters as well as theater. And so I've actually thought, based on the Buchty loutky principle of adapting movies, to do a Tarkovsky adaptation of Stalker, the movie Stalker, where he's throwing the nut trying to get to the zone, and just do it outside in the wilderness. No theater at all. Because puppetry can do that sort of thing. It can raise all sorts of questions, not only about the ideas, but also about the nature of the material world itself. This is sand puppetry, in a sense, done by a Czech. But the Ukrainians actually get into this sort of sand stuff. This is also, you can obviously make puppetry out of pretty much anything. I think one of the big revelations to me is that the grammar of puppetry has expanded from being just little homunculi and animal creatures to pretty much anything you can imagine made out of any material or any object. So the grammar is anything that you can move, practically, which to me is one of the things that makes it fresh. This is actually an automaton from Europe, but you could include an automaton. For instance, she plays the piano. She really plays some sort of musical instrument here. But you could put this as part of a character in a puppet play, and you would never know the difference in terms of who's a character and who's not. This also is kind of a puppet as well. And of course, you see here puppets. Now, this to me would be a great toy to have, as opposed to some of the big-eyed, stuffy little plush creatures we have. Because there's a lot of character in there. And of course, the question I ask, yes, it must be real rabbit fur. And of course, puppetry can also hit the dark side of the spectrum. So it's not just funny little creatures and stuff. It can also raise all sorts of questions. These are some of the other students that I didn't see from the Institute of Marionettes, the International Institute of Marionettes in Schaubude. This is also a student production. So just a wide variety of, it's almost what your imagination can conceive given the material nature of the world. And this is actually a film of live puppets that a friend of mine down in Los Angeles made, based again on Czech puppetry. She's got another one based on her kind of memoirs of her grandmother, which is one of the most touching marionette films I've ever seen. and her name is Genevieve Anderson. And again, any kind of material you can imagine. This is obviously a found doll head, bunches of keys. What is that? Is that spark plugs on the side? I don't know. And finally, yeah, why not fire? So essentially, that's the world of puppetry. And what I wanted you to see is that one of the reasons that I really wanted to do this, to explore this stuff, and to then start doing it, is because as a Christian who has been studying, my main areas of study have been music and film. But I came to a conclusion back in the late 90s that film, more importantly music, which had been so important in the 1960s, where there was this hint that maybe, more than a hint, a statement that music would lead to change in society, revolution, a search for meaning, all of these things found in music. What I discovered by the end of the 90s is music had become containment for many people. For most of us, music is the thing you wear on your head. It's kind of your personal soundtrack. You go around, you're listening to stuff, and that's not about liberation. That's not about freedom. That's about I don't know what, but it's certainly not. It doesn't liberate you. What was interesting is while I was taking my puppet tour in I know what I wanted to show. While I was taking my puppet tour in 2005. Someone invited me to a rock club in Berlin, and there were 3 bands playing, and I think one was English and one was American. I can't remember what the third one was because I left before that. But I remember going there. Now, I've been to my share of rock clubs, and the truth is, I just, was watching the bands playing and stuff, and everyone was standing doing exactly what you do at a rock club. If you came to stand around and be cool, you'd do that. And if you came to do this, you did that. And then you walked out. And I thought to myself, and everyone knows exactly how they're going to respond here. So there's nothing really happening. And I thought about all the puppet shows, and how I'd walk out my head going with ideas. And I said, puppetry, 21st century. And I remember having this moment in Salzburg. A lot of other things were happening in my life at that moment because I just lost my job and such. But I'd just seen the Salzburg Marionnette Theater. And I thought, well, they have a great technique. But they're playing it with pre-recorded music. In fact, I remember sitting there thinking wow, I wonder if puppetry could get to the point where the artists were as good as the Salzburg Marionette Theater, but as imaginative as Buchty or loutky. And I actually mentioned that to one of them, and he said, I don't think that's ever going to happen, he said, because to do what we do, you just have to be completely free of the more restrictions that the other art would place. But I'm not sure about that. So, any questions? This is Henryk Jurkowski, who's the foremost puppet historian living today. Lives in Warsaw, and 85 years old.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you spell the name of the Quay brothers over there?
Q-U-A-Y.
Q-Y.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, again, within all of these people, I just, when you go to watch them, don't expect to understand or even to find, it's not going to be friendly, because they're not trying to, but they are very interesting, and I get a lot out of them. The Quay brothers, I always feel like I need to write a doctoral dissertation afterwards, but yeah.
I was wondering, I hope this isn't a controversial question. I was wondering whether there's anything in the roots of puppetry that's anti-Semitic in any way, because I saw a number of the characters, a number of the characters who are kind of the bad guy. Oh, as if there was
no. It's just pure caricature. I mean, I can't think of any character that I showed you that. There's they have the big noses and stuff, but that's just because Punch is like an Italian. And a lot of them are based on Punch. And he's always got a big hook nose and a hunchback often. So it's just part of the imagery. But I wouldn't say there's anything particularly anti-Semitic. Although originally in the Roman era, the puppetry was evidently very political, but also very over the top by almost anyone's standards today, and very scatological as well. And so the Christians did not approve of puppetry, but they didn't approve of the theater at that time for the same reasons. There was some, I mean, if you look into the history of Roman theater, there's some pretty intense, bizarre stuff going on there. And I think it needed the incubation period for Europe of the Middle Ages to become the kind of puppetry that was separated from both the religious and the Roman and the antique world and those kinds of associations. But that's true with a lot of art as well. And
so why is it that there's so much intensity and bizarre puppetry? Because it seems to me that there's more of that than there is of the light and funny.
No, if you're in America, you're 90-1 light and funny. I'm emphasizing this other side mostly to, and part of my intention is to break down the stereotype that puppets are just for children. But in fact, these kind of plush little puppet toys. I mean, at my church, where I go to church in Alaska, in a Presbyterian church, they have a couple people who do puppet shows. And they are basically Muppets. And they are cute, cuddly little creatures who then give little Christian messages about, yes, and you should read your Bible. But they do this during church. And I'm always sitting there going, just trying very hard, because there's no artistry in it, for one thing. But also because I have a problem with cuteness in general as a mode of communication. And I think cuteness is needs a lot of, people need to look at that a lot harder than they have been. But there's plenty of light puppets. In fact, in America, that's what happened. Television came in the 1940s and 50s, and it all turned into, it's hard to find darker puppets. So one of the reasons I'm emphasizing it here is just to prove once and for all, oh yeah, there's plenty of room for this sort of thing. And there's nothing to say you can't do pleasant little children's puppets either. But since there's so much of that, I chose not to emphasize it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I grew up with Lamb Chop.
Exactly. But that's an American puppet. Yeah, exactly.
But then as I got older, there was always creepy movies made with horrid puppet faces.
Oh, yeah.
Puppets became more creepy.
Well, yeah. Well, of course, in horror films and such, I can think of quite a few horror films that use dark puppet imagery. But I think, like I say, it's part of the dual nature of the puppet. On one hand, it's kind of connected to the doll and the toy, but on the other hand, it kind of goes back into religious imagery. There's a sense of the mysterious, which in our society can be pushed into the horrific easily. But to my mind, it also has many qualities. Puppetry has many qualities that I think as we move into the 21st century. And I mean, one of the things I saw over and over again in my travels this time in Europe is just people doing this. Just sitting looking at whatever they were holding that had a screen on it. And then you go into an airport and there's screens doing this or that. There's television, there's movies. It's like video games. We're surrounded by this artificial, virtual world that we've constructed. And the thing about puppetry, and the thing that I think that the puppeteers really understand, the people involved with puppetry, is it's all about being able to hold something. It's, in a sense, it fights against the virtual.
I'm not afraid of losing myself into technologies instead of losing myself out of them, kind of, actually, because I'm used to be close to nature, used to be connected with the world, and I'm kind of afraid that technologies can take it away from me. Yeah, never thought about this, but yeah. Not so much that I can get lost in the technologies, as everything I love can be destroyed by it. And it's really sad. I've never thought about this, and now it's really sad. And maybe puppetry is the way how to run away from these thoughts. Like to notice that the ground is still ground. It's still the same as it was in my childhood. Okay, maybe something has changed, but it's still ground. I still notice that it's ground, or it's the sea, and it's quite the same as it was. But I'm afraid what will be after 50 or 500 years. I don't know.
Even the people who make like Švankmajer's puppet movies and the brothers Quay's puppet movies are extraordinarily textured and tactile. And I think that's not an accident. However, in American puppetry, there tends to be a sense of, you just have the cute, fuzzy object, and it's usually in a very blank kind of setting. It's very neat. Or it could be in a contemporary setting if it's set outside or something like that. But I think puppetry contains many of the elements. It's certainly not the thing that would, change this or that, but it certainly is, I think, one vehicle for communicating in a time when it's very hard to communicate because there's so much, just a chaos of information out there. But I can speak from experience, having dragged puppets around, that when people see them, it leaves some sort of interesting impression.
Can you talk about the nativity thing you mentioned at the beginning? Like there's some sort of nativity show, something with puppets or like...
Well, yeah, it's a traditional, before you get even to the Punch and Judy's and all of those kind of commedia dell'arte based puppets, they're more like in the clown tradition and such. You get churches used in the Middle Ages, they used puppets, and there were puppeteers connected with churches, and sometimes they were done within the walls somewhere of the church. Eventually, before I say eventually, let me say that it was just a standard part of puppetry repertoire. And puppets, for instance, are mentioned in Shakespeare. They're not necessarily called puppets, they're sometimes called motions. They're also mentioned in Ben Jonson. And in fact, the first person we know of with a name connected to puppetry is this person he calls Captain Pod. Which is a pretty funny name. But I think that it's kind of fascinating that the puppet shows were done. They did full life versions of miracle morality plays as well. But these could travel much better than a full life production could. And that was one of the advantages of the puppet theater.
Did you say there was one you're doing now, though?
Oh, yeah. Well, the Teschner one that I mentioned is going to be in Vienna, and it's going to be at the Austrian Theater Museum. They have his original, it's this very unusual circle that he performed all his stuff in. And so they're going to set that up, and they have a man who is a scholar on how he performed his puppets, and there are some films of his puppetry to let us know. So they're going to recreate them for the month of December. So that's quite a nice little thing. But the Austrians tend to have more nativity plays and such than other people I've noticed. Although the Czechs still occasionally will do a nativity play and such. I think culturally I think Czechs have the highest proportion of atheists of any European country, thanks to all sorts of stuff in their history. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any names of you mentioned the brothers Quay or Philadelphia, but of people in Canada or North America or in America.
Yeah, there's quite a few people.
Are maybe using, like you guys use the Empire State Building and just drawing these, drawing our attention to different parts of our own culture, our modern culture.
Actually, Canada has, I would say, more interesting puppeteers than America, probably, certainly per capita. And I have a friend who was one of the students who graduated when I was visiting the International Puppetry School there. And she went on to do the shadow puppets behind Feist's performances when she toured the world. So, but no, there are quite a few different puppeteers. I would have to research it. I'm leaving in a couple of days, but maybe I can give you a list before I go of the Canadians I know. But I know in America, Vermont and North Carolina are particularly interesting states for puppetry. And Vermont has 2 or 3 very interesting puppet theaters. One is the Sandglass Theater. Another one is an organization called Bread and Puppet, which did a lot of very large puppetry. Got started in the 60s by a German, Peter Schumann, I think. But he came to America and started doing these, and they were kind of they ended up being these large spectacles that they did on this property up there. And they also used to host these great puppet festivals. And so that was an important one. There's another one called the Paper Hand Puppet Company in North Carolina. In Atlanta, Georgia, they have the American Puppetry Institute. And so they often have puppet shows coming through there, although I have never been there. Los Angeles actually has some puppet activity going on. And of course, it makes sense when you realize how many special effects are actually puppets, even today. Not just stop motion animation, but for instance, if there's some sort of prosthetic effect, all the prosthetic effects are essentially puppetry. That is to say, something's happening at the end of someone's arm, and you see it move. And it might be just for a moment, but it's being radio controlled by someone, and that's a form of puppetry. If I was doing a documentary on American puppetry, I might end with that form of puppetry as being there. And New York has quite a few different puppet theaters, which unfortunately I didn't know until I actually left New York, what was going on. There's a nice, actually, Czechoslovak Marionnette puppet company in New York, and there are various things. I get an announcement from the Henson Corporation every couple of weeks about new stuff happening in the New York area. So it is there. It's just much more spread out and much less common. And only in certain locales, particularly New York, Los Angeles, Vermont, and North Carolina, do you really run into people who have any sort of appreciation for the art of puppetry. So, yeah.
Let's see. I just had two thoughts. I was trying to decide which one to go with. Well, I'll just ask you a comment on both of them. One thing I was thinking about is, why do you think it is, or just what are your comments on why do you think it is that people find puppets so, I think you kind of hit on it a little bit already, but why are they kind of magical and amazing? Why are we so I don't know. It feels like there's something to them that are just puppets in general. But.
Right. When I was just talking with the puppet historian, Henryk Jurkowski, I asked him a similar question. And he said something about the fact that they are simulacra of us. And that anytime you make a version of yourself, it gets very fascinating. In a sense, and also there's a lot of metaphoric possibilities with puppetry that don't even exist with human actors. So, for instance, you can do, and there have been quite a few of these particular kinds of puppet shows with marionettes, where the connection between the string and the marionette and the performer starts to become the relationship between the human and God, and the string being the connection. Now, of course, you can push this in all sorts of ways and say all sorts of things with it. And in one of the classic ones, I think a Pierrot puppet in France, cuts the string, and then, of course, dies, because there is no life apart from the person breathing life into it. Also, I think there is something deep going on here, and again, I was talking with the same puppet historian, Jurkowski, and he said something about how it's a dead object. It isn't actually anything living or anything, until the puppeteer gives it life. And then ever after, it has some residual of the life that's been given to it, which I immediately said to him, it's kind of like the, first chapter of Genesis or so, the first two chapters of Genesis, and God breathes into the dust to create us. In the sense, there's a similar process of the animation of material. And I think that in there's probably something. But I also think it's like I've seen children at some Buchty loutky shows, and I was sitting there going like, are they getting this? Because this is bizarre stuff. And they were just like, or in Poland, I would be at theaters, and the Polish figured out something, and they kept doing this ever since the communist times. They made contracts with all of the schools to come see puppet shows. And of course, the schools would pay them a certain amount, and there'd be government reimbursement. But basically, they've kept their puppet theaters completely full with school contracts. But you see like a whole group of children who are, in fact, when it comes to audiences, if anyone's going to be noisy and loud and stuff, little children are. But as soon as the puppet show starts, except when they know to react, but suddenly they just become glued to it. And I think part of it is just the fascination of seeing this version of life that is I don't know, there's something metaphorical going on, something very interesting. And I would say that gives puppetry its kind of some of the power that it has. And there's no other art form quite like that. So,
are we pushing our time, or is there?
I don't know. Do we have to go? So.
The other thing I was going to ask you about, and it's interesting talking to you or hearing you this week, is this. You're kind of setting up a little bit of a tension between sort of technology or some of the, I don't know how to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just as you're talking about like the screens or the virtual world, the digital world that we're living with, but like all of a sudden I'm having these images of like the Wii video game or something, which is almost a form of puppetry.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I'm just wondering if you see any like
I would say
potential for the things that you're sort of talking, that you're sort of like setting up, not against, but like sort of this tension that you're setting up, like for them to sort of marry and all of a sudden bring in the things that we've got going right now digitally and technologically.
Right. The problem is, I mean, and I even had to use screens to show you this stuff. The problem is that the screen puts an extra layer of mediation between us and the thing. And I would say that the glory of puppetry is particularly the less degree of mediation there is between you and it. And I would say that's true in many areas in life. So my feeling is that, one could say that there's definitely some relationships between a Wii game or, some sort of virtual ski sort of thing. But ultimately, it is still a screen that we're interacting with, and that changes everything. So not that screens are evil, but that if that's all we have, if that's our relationship to the world, we get in trouble. So I guess my feeling is I think puppetry as puppetry is the thing which carries the antidote in it. There might be other forms, digital puppetry you might call it, that could have some very interesting ramifications and might indeed produce something artistic. But I would say that it's like the difference between seeing theater and seeing it in a play just on television. It's just not the same. So.
But you could take the technology in a different direction in terms of like robotics and. Is that something that you see in the future of poetry, or is the beauty in the tactility of moving?
For my own sake, the beauty is in the tactility, but there are lines running out from puppetry, and one of the lines runs from the puppet to the automaton to the robot, and so but then there is the human interaction with technology, which takes us into the android. But and I was just talking with one of the people on my trip about the possibility of android theater. These kind of like biomechanical kinds of things. There's all sorts of possibilities, and there are dark possibilities. Just because these things are really interesting and imaginative doesn't mean they're all good. So I mean, there's some very odd dolls and toys and things out there that if you interact with them in certain ways, that could be very bizarre and weird and run counter to everything I've been saying.
Are you familiar with Warhorse, the West End show?
Yeah, so, I really wished I could see that on the stage.
Huge hit, which is basically sort of horse puppetry.
Right. Yeah.
Brilliant.
So. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
As promised, here is my update on my puppet-related activities since the lecture I gave at L'Abri in 2012, which included me continuing on my way. Eventually, I met the Quay brothers, which was very important, but also very important was I met a friend, Paulette Caron, in France, who became a very good friend. She eventually came and visited me in Alaska. She was a young puppeteer, and she helped, in a sense, bring some of the French puppetry techniques to Haines, Alaska. And in 2013, we produced a piece with my Reckoning Motions troupe called The Calliope, which was kind of a Faustian take with an organ player and strange dancers who did whatever the organ player asked, but they also demanded various sounds and sights and such. Then in 2014, she returned, and we did a version of Everyman as a puppet show called Every Puppet. Also in 2014, around the same time, in fact, exactly at the same time as Paulette returned, and she got a chance to go into the schools and teach, and that was very interesting. But we had a museum show at the Sheldon Museum, which I curated, and that was quite interesting. We had over 100 puppets that we had managed to find in the town, and over half of them, well over half of them, were made by us, and that is to say, they were made for the Lilliputian Puppet Sideshow. They were made for there were two groups that split off. One was my group, Reckoning Motions, and the other group was called Geppetto's Junkyard. And between all of the different, the three organizations, plus a few other local individuals, we had probably 70 puppets. Just our groups had more than 50, about 60 puppets there. So it was quite a nice little show. In 2014, I also did some personal crowdfunding to try to get money for my Gravity from Above documentary project on European puppet theaters. But, that was painful. It was near the end of the year. I just wasn't able to get much money. I had to keep delaying it. The organization I went through allowed me to delay it, but instead of being a month, it was like 3 months. Only got about $5,000, which was not enough to do anything, but it was enough to allow me to buy a new computer and to do better editing, to get a Final Cut program, things like that. So that was good. But also at the end of 2014, my mother at the time had a bad accident, which led to about a 7-month decline until her death in 2015. And so that period was a very difficult time for me. Obviously, the Gravity from Above stuff and the puppet stuff all just came to a halt during that period because life intervened. After my mother's death, I did receive it wasn't, well, let's put it to you this way. I got a little bit of insurance money, enough to say to myself, let's get back to Europe and continue Gravity from Above. Also, let's try to get to Georgia for the first time. I had already been thinking about it in 2012 when I gave the lecture. But I'm not going to go into, obviously, this whole thing. I could take all of this and make it a 2-hour discussion in itself, what all these things were. But basically, I spent the end of 2015 preparing to go back to Europe. I went there with my mother's insurance money. She had no money. Didn't come from exactly a well-off family. So I ended up there the first part of 2016, which was great. Got a great interview with the Quay brothers. Spent more time in Prague and other places. And finally got to Georgia, which I spent 3 weeks there. And that was pretty much, as one can tell, a life-altering event, which didn't immediately say to me, oh, you have to go live there, but it certainly impressed me quite a bit. In 2017, I was kind of like, okay, now what do I do? How do I get back to Europe? Crowdfunding takes so much out of you. I'd already done it twice. The second time was just brutal, so I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to do it again. And I was only doing it through Facebook friends. So, and I have quite a few Facebook friends, but, there's kind of a rule. If you've got, 300 Facebook friends, about 30 will contribute. And that's just how it works. You can't make people give, or you don't want to put too much pressure on people. So, but in 2017, I decided, okay, I had an interesting schedule where I'd work in tours in the summer, and I would try to coast my way around to do creative things. So one of the things I did in early 2017 was I had a puppet class for some students in Haines. And that actually was great. Had I stayed in Alaska, I would have continued doing that. But then, out of that, I said, well, let's do a play too. So I wrote a play called 21st Century Faust, which I actually printed up, and I have piles of these books somewhere, but I can't get at them because they're locked away in Alaska, so I can't even sell them. It was like, as soon as I received the box, I also received the news that they were shutting down my apartment. I mean, not apartment. I lived in this really great house, got a great deal on it. I rented it for the whole time. And the landlords decided they were retiring. They didn't want to deal with property anymore. So they were going to sell the house. So they gave me 6 months to get out. I thought about it. And I said to myself, well, what am I going to do now? Well, I thought to myself, well, I've got a certain amount of money from the summer. I would be paying rent. Well, what if we don't pay rent? What if we put it in storage? What if we go back to Europe and do another session of Gravity from Above? And then a friend of mine I had met in Georgia had an apartment that she was going to rent. And I thought to myself, well, let's go take her apartment. And so after a while, I had 6 months of time, 3 months in Europe, 3 months in Georgia. And I came here. And out of that, I was offered a job helping to make a puppet museum in Georgia. And also I thought I would be getting a certain amount of money from the French Puppetry Institute, which will remain unnamed here. So I spent that summer preparing to go, put everything into that wasn't in storage, finally into deep storage. And I went, and the first 3 months of traveling were amazing. And then I started getting bad news about the money from France was not coming through. And then I came here and discovered I did do some teaching for the museums and stuff, and then discovered that the museum was probably, wasn't going to happen the way I thought it was at all. So I decided, nope, let's not do that. But we're still staying in Georgia. And I've made friends with puppeteers here. I'll probably have a chance to do more teaching with puppetry and to actually work on some puppet plays here. And here we are. I started doing YouTube, The Anadromist. And that kind of brings us up to date. Obviously, like I said, I could have spent a lot more time discussing all of this, but I wanted to give you a quick summary of what I've been doing puppet-wise since 2012 when I gave the lecture. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. If you want to support this channel, you can do so through PayPal, and you'll get extra content. Details on some video that's around here somewhere. What about right there? Anyway, thanks for listening to all of this long lecture from Labrie from 2012, and I hope it was interesting for you and that you begin to understand why puppetry.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
Hi there, howdy doody. Hi, kids at home. Hi, Clarabelle. And look at all the wonderful kids in the peanut gallery. Hi, kids. What time is it? You're right. Let's sing the theme. Okay, Professor? Here we go.